Hey everyone, and welcome back to Boss Economic World, the only place on the internet that treats the global economy like the high-stakes, high-drama, often completely irrational soap opera that it truly is. I'm your host, and today we're strapping in for another dizzying ride on the world's most terrifying roller coaster, US-China relations. So, get this. The big news lighting up terminals from Wall Street to Shanghai is that the negotiators are heading back to the table. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng are set to have a cozy little chat in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, next week. The goal? To stop their bosses, President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping, from pressing the big red button labeled global economic meltdown. Now, if you've been following this saga, and let's be honest, it's got more plot twists than a season of Succession, you'll know that just last week, things were looking, well, apocalyptic. That's right. Just a week ago, President Trump, fresh off his 2024 return to the White House and still riding that wave of maximum pressure politics, was absolutely furious. Why? Because Beijing made some loud noises about turning off the spigot for rare earth elements. In response, Trump didn't just threaten to raise tariffs, he went nuclear, declaring a 100% import surtax on all Chinese goods, effective November 1st. For those of you keeping score at home, that's not just a trade war, that's a trade carpet bombing. The markets, predictably, had a collective heart attack. The S&P 500 shed 500 points in 2 days. The VIX, the market's fear index, looked like it had seen a ghost. Corporate lobbyists in D.C. were practically setting themselves on fire on the steps of the Capitol. And then, poof. Just yesterday, Trump tells Fox Business that those same sky-high tariffs are, and I quote, not sustainable. Treasury Secretary Bessent is now describing his talks with his Chinese counterpart as frank and detailed. The White House is signaling that the big presidential sit-down between Trump and Xi at the APEC summit in South Korea is back on. So, what in the name of John Maynard Keynes is going on here? Did everyone just attend a weekend trust fall retreat? Is this a genuine thaw, or is it just the part of the horror movie where everything gets quiet right before the monster jumps out again? To understand this, we need to do what we do best here at Boss Economic World, restore the full picture. Let's break down the players, the stakes, and the multi-trillion-dollar poker game they're all playing. First, you have to understand the personalities driving this train. This isn't just about economic theory, it's about political survival and massive egos. On the US side, you have President Donald Trump. His playbook hasn't changed since his first term. It's the art of the deal on a global scale: create a crisis, make outrageous threats to establish maximum leverage, unnerve your opponent, and then swoop in as the reasonable dealmaker who can solve the problem he created. Remember, Trump's 2024 victory was narrow. He's facing pressure from two sides. His base loves the tough on China rhetoric. They cheer for the tariffs. But the big money corporate donors, the CEOs of the Fortune 500, are screaming bloody murder. A 100% tariff isn't a negotiating tactic, it's a suicide vest for their supply chains. A recent report from the Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated that a 100% tariff would effectively function as a $600 billion a year tax on American consumers and businesses, likely triggering a recession within 2 quarters. Your next iPhone? Add $500. The parts for that new Ford F-150 Lightning? The cost just doubled. So Trump has to look tough without actually crashing the car. Then you have China's President Xi Jinping. If Trump is all about chaotic energy and public spectacle, Xi is the opposite. He's playing the long game. His primary concern is internal stability. China's economy in 2025 is still grappling with the hangover from its real estate crisis. Youth unemployment, while down from its peak, remains a stubborn political problem. Xi cannot afford a massive economic shock that would come from being totally cut off from the US market. But he also can't afford to look weak. The US has been tightening the screws for years, especially on technology. The CHIPS Act and subsequent export controls have been designed to kneecap China's semiconductor ambitions. So when Xi's government threatens to control rare earth exports, it's not a random act of aggression. It's him picking up his strongest poker chip and slamming it on the table. It's his way of saying, you think you can live without our tech components? Fine. You try building your F-35s, your wind turbines, and your EV motors without our magnets. Finally, you have the fixers, Bessent and He Lifeng. These are the guys who have to translate the political bluster into something resembling policy. Think of them as the world's most stressed-out wedding planners, trying to stop the bride and groom from calling the whole thing off. They've been on a world tour of tense conference rooms: Madrid, Stockholm, London, Geneva, and now Kuala Lumpur. Their job is to find a face-saving off-ramp for both leaders. They deal in details, tariff codes, export license categories, and purchase agreements, while Trump and Xi deal in headlines. Okay, let's get into the weeds. What are the actual weapons being brandished here? Weapon number 1, the US tariff hammer. Trump's 100% tariff threat was a showstopper. But let's not forget the existing situation. We've been living with a complex web of tariffs for years. The truce that's set to expire in November was Washington pausing a planned hike to 145% on a range of goods. Let's be crystal clear about what these tariffs do. They are not, as is often claimed, paid by China. They are taxes paid by American importers, who then pass those costs on to American consumers. You. Me. All of us. Look at this. Since 2018, U.S. Customs has collected over $250 billion in these tariffs. That's money that used to be in the private sector, either as corporate profit or in consumers' pockets. Economists at the University of Chicago and the Federal Reserve have published multiple studies showing a near 100% pass-through rate to U.S. prices. The threat of 100% tariffs sent shockwaves through specific industries. Apple, which has spent years trying to diversify its supply chain, still does final assembly for over 90% of its iPhones in China. Their stock fell 8% on the day of Trump's threat. Ford and GM, who are all in on the EV transition, rely on China for an estimated 75% of their battery components and processed lithium. Their joint statement last week warned of catastrophic disruptions to production. This is Trump's hammer. It's big, it's loud, and it does a lot of damage to both sides. He's betting that China's economy is more fragile and can withstand the pain less than the US can. Weapon number 2, China's rare earth ace. If tariffs are America's hammer, rare earths are China's stiletto, a small, sharp weapon aimed at a precise, vital spot. What are rare earths? They're a group of 17 elements like neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium that are the secret sauce in everything high-tech. They're not actually rare, but they are incredibly difficult and environmentally toxic to mine and process into usable high-purity metals and magnets. And China has a stranglehold on this process. While mining has started to diversify, with mines like the Mountain Pass facility in California coming back online, the crucial, complex, and dirty midstream processing is still overwhelmingly dominated by China. The US mines the ore at Mountain Pass, and where does it send it for processing? You guessed it. China. It's like growing your own wheat and then sending it to your rival to be milled into flour. When Beijing hinted at broad controls, the panic was real, especially in the defense and green tech sectors. Each F-35 fighter jet requires about 920 pounds of rare earth materials. Each new generation nuclear submarine? A couple of tons. The powerful magnets in EV motors and wind turbines are made of neodymium. The last time China seriously restricted exports back in 2010, prices for some elements skyrocketed by over 3,000%. This time, the threat alone was enough. Raytheon and Lockheed Martin executives were on the phone with the Pentagon within hours. Shares of Vestas, the world's largest wind turbine maker, tumbled. It was a stark reminder that while the US is trying to cut China off from future tech, China can cut the US off from the tech we depend on right now. So, Besant and Hao Lifeng aren't just meeting in Malaysia to talk about tariffs and minerals. They are on the front lines of a much larger global realignment. 1. The Tech Cold War. This is the real battle. The US is determined to slow China's technological ascent, viewing it as an existential threat to its long-term economic and military dominance. China is equally determined to achieve technological self-sufficiency, what it calls dual circulation, to become immune to American pressure. The fights over tariffs and rare earths are just skirmishes in this larger war. 2. The Great Supply Chain Scramble. For the last 30 years, the global business model was simple: efficiency at all costs. That meant manufacturing everything in China. That model is now broken. Companies aren't necessarily decoupling entirely, but they are desperately de-risking. They're adopting a China Plus One strategy, looking for alternative manufacturing hubs in places like Vietnam, India, Mexico, and, you guessed it, Malaysia. The fact that this meeting is being held in Kuala Lumpur is no accident. It's a nod to the growing importance of Southeast Asia as the world's new workshop. 3. The global fallout. The rest of the world is watching this drama with a giant bowl of popcorn and a healthy dose of terror. Germany's export-driven economy shudders every time Trump tweets about tariffs. Developing nations that supply raw materials to China see demand for their exports flicker. The International Monetary Fund, in its latest outlook, explicitly stated that a re-escalation of US-China trade tensions is the single biggest threat to global growth, potentially pushing a fragile Europe back into recession. So, what can we realistically expect from this meeting of the fixers? Let's rule out a grand bargain. There will be no comprehensive deal that solves all these issues. The fundamental conflict is too deep. Instead, we're likely to see one of two outcomes. Scenario A, the kick the can extension. This is the most probable outcome. Besant and Hao Lifeng will hash out a temporary extension of the current truce. China will likely offer a quiet, behind-the-scenes assurance that the rare earth spigot will remain open. They might also throw in a sweetener that Trump can brag about, like a commitment to purchase a large amount of US soybeans or liquefied natural gas. In return, the US will formally shelve the 100% tariff threat and agree to keep the existing tariffs paused. This allows both presidents to go to their big APEC meeting looking like statesmen who have pulled the world back from the brink. It solves nothing long-term, but it buys time and calms the markets. Scenario B, the mini deal. This is a slightly more ambitious version of Scenario A. It would involve the US not just pausing new tariffs, but actually rolling back a small, symbolic tranche of the existing ones, perhaps on consumer goods that are most visible to voters. In exchange, China would have to make a more concrete, public commitment, not just on rare earths but perhaps on intellectual property enforcement, an old US grievance. This would be harder to achieve, as it requires both sides to give up something tangible. The doomsday scenario, a total collapse of talks leading to the November 1st tariff apocalypse, is unlikely for now. The economic blowback would be too severe for either leader to absorb at this moment. Trump has seen the market reaction and knows it could jeopardize the economy heading into the 2026 midterms. She needs stability above all else. So, my money is on a classic kick the can deal. Expect to see headlines next week about constructive talks and progress and a framework for future discussion. It's the geopolitical equivalent of putting duct tape on a leaking dam. It will hold for a while, but the pressure is still building. This isn't the end of the US-China economic conflict. It's not even the beginning of the end. It is, perhaps, just the end of the beginning of a new, more volatile, and permanently confrontational era. The drama is far from over. That's all the time we have for today. Don't just follow the headlines, understand the game. Stay sharp, stay skeptical, and I'll see you next time on Boss Economic World.